My name is Mark Ryland. I'm 48 years old, and for 20 of those years, I was a ranger in the United States Army. When I retired, I came home to Michigan, to the quiet and the cold and the deep woods that felt more like home than any barracks ever did. I'm not a man given to flights of fancy. I believe in what I can see, what I can touch, and what I can put around through. The world to me has always been a straightforward place with rules, physics, and a clear line between predator and prey. I'm telling you this so you understand that what I'm about to describe isn't a ghost story or a tall tale told around a campfire. It's a report. It's the truest and most honest account I can give of the 3 days in October that broke the world I thought I knew. It was our annual trip, the one Cal and I had been taking since we were teenagers. A week of deer hunting deep in the Ottawa National Forest, up in the peninsula. This year, Cal's brother-in-law, Brian, decided to tag along. Brian was a good guy, a city guy from Grand Rapids who thought roughing it was when the hotel Wi-Fi was slow. He'd borrowed a rifle and bought a brand new camouflage jacket that was still stiff with factory starch. Cal and I just looked at each other and smiled. We figured he'd last 2 nights before he started complaining about the cold and his sore back. We had no idea. Our spot was remote, the kind you can only get to with a serious 4-wheel drive and a good set of maps. We took Cal's F-250, bouncing for the last 6 miles down a logging trail that was more rock and rut than road. The trail ended in a small natural clearing maybe 50 yards from a feeder creek. It was perfect. Dense pine and birch forest on all sides, a thick canopy overhead, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. We set up camp methodically, a practiced routine honed over decades. 2 heavy-duty canvas tents, a large one for Cal and me, a smaller one for Brian. We dug a fire pit, stacked a cord of wood we'd brought in, and set up our gear. By the time the sun started to dip below the tree line, casting long, skeletal shadows across the clearing, we had a crackling fire going and 3 camp chairs set up in a semicircle around it. The air grew cold fast, the way it does in the UP in late fall. You could feel the dampness seeping out of the ground. The fire was the center of our universe, a bubble of warmth and light against a vast, indifferent darkness. Brian was already shivering, huddled in his chair trying to make jokes about seeing his breath. Cal was quiet, cleaning his rifle with a familiar steady motion, his face calm in the firelight. I was just taking it all in, the smell of pine smoke, the taste of cheap whiskey from my flask, the immense star-dusted sky visible through the gaps in the trees. It was the kind of peace I'd spent my whole life chasing. It felt safe. It felt normal. The first thing that was wrong was the silence. It happened around 9 o'clock. We'd finished eating and the conversation had died down to a comfortable quiet. That's when I noticed it. The normal night sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, had all stopped, not faded out. Stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. The silence that replaced it was absolute, unnatural. It was a dead, waiting kind of silence that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I glanced over at Cal. He was looking out into the darkness past the fire, his hands still on his rifle, but his movements had ceased. He'd felt it too. I saw him slowly scan the tree line, his eyes narrowed. Brian hadn't noticed a thing. He was poking the fire with a stick, humming to himself. "You hear that?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Brian looked up. "Hear what? I don't hear anything." "Exactly," Cal said, his voice a low rumble. He lowered his rifle and set it across his lap. The silence pressed in on us, heavy and expectant. We sat like that for what felt like an hour, straining our ears for any sound. But there was nothing but the crackle of the fire and the blood pounding in my ears. We tried to rationalize it. A predator in the area, maybe a wolf pack or a bear, something that would make the smaller creatures go quiet. It was plausible. We were in their territory after all. But it didn't feel right. I've been around bears my whole life. They make noise. They're clumsy. A wolf pack might make the woods go quiet for a moment as it passes, but not like this. This was a complete and total shutdown of the entire ecosystem. It felt like the woods themselves were holding their breath. Then came the sound. It was a single, heavy thump from deep in the woods to the north of our camp. It sounded like a massive tree falling over, but there was no splintering crack of the trunk, no cascade of breaking branches. It was just one solid, ground-shaking impact.
Brian jumped, spilling a little of his coffee. Jesus, what was that?
Cal and I looked at each other. Widowmaker, Cal said, trying to sound convinced. Big dead branch finally letting go. I nodded, but I didn't believe it. The sound was too clean, too deliberate. It was the sound of something immense being dropped from a great height. After the thump, the silence returned, somehow even deeper and more unnerving than before. We stayed up for another hour, rifles in hand, but nothing else happened. Eventually, the cold and a sense of weary unease drove us into our tents. Sleep didn't come easy. Every snap of a cooling log in the fire pit, every gust of wind that rustled the tent canvas sounded like a footstep. I lay in my sleeping bag, my Remington 870 loaded with slugs resting beside me, and stared into the darkness. I was a trained soldier. I'd slept in places where death was a constant, tangible presence, but I had never felt a fear like this. It was a primal, ancient dread, the kind our ancestors must have felt huddling in caves, listening to things with teeth and claws circle them in the night. The second day passed in a haze of forced normalcy. We went out hunting at dawn, splitting up as we usually did. But the woods felt different, empty. We saw no tracks, no deer, not even a squirrel. It was as if every living thing had packed up and left the county. The oppressive silence from the night before lingered under the daylight. We met back at camp around midday, empty-handed and on edge. We didn't talk about the night before, but it hung in the air between us. Brian tried to keep a brave face, making jokes, but his eyes were constantly darting towards the tree line. He stayed close to the fire, close to the camp. He didn't venture out again. That night, the feeling of being watched started the moment the sun went down. It was a physical sensation, a pressure at the back of my neck. I kept turning, expecting to see a pair of eyes staring back from the darkness, but there was nothing. We ate in near silence, the pretense of a normal hunting trip stripped away. We were 3 men on a tiny island of light, surrounded by a hostile and unknown ocean of black. We cleaned our weapons again, checked our ammunition. It was an unspoken admission. We were preparing for a fight. We decided to keep the fire roaring all night and take turns on watch. I took the first shift. Cal and Brian retreated to their tents, though I doubt either of them slept. I sat in my camp chair, my shotgun across my lap, and stared into the impenetrable wall of trees. The silence was back, absolute and suffocating. The fire cast dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes, turning stumps into crouching figures and branches into reaching arms. For 2 hours, nothing happened. I was just starting to think my fatigue was getting the better of me, that I was letting the spooky silence infect my imagination. Then I heard the footsteps. They were slow, heavy, and deliberate, and they were bipedal, 2 feet. A heavy rhythmic tread that crushed leaves and snapped twigs with an authority that no 4-legged animal possesses. It wasn't the ambling shuffle of a bear or the light-footed trot of a deer. This was the stride of something that walked upright, something with weight and purpose. It was circling our camp, staying just beyond the reach of the firelight, a moving patch of deeper darkness in the shadows. My blood ran cold. I raised the shotgun, the stock cold and solid against my cheek, and tracked the sound as it moved. It made a complete circle of the clearing, a slow, deliberate patrol. It was inspecting us, sizing us up. The sheer arrogance of it was terrifying. It wasn't trying to be stealthy. It wanted us to know it was there.
It was demonstrating its dominance, letting us know that the darkness belonged to it, and we were trespassers.
From his tent, Brian's terrified voice cut through the silence. "Mark? Is that you out there?" His voice was thin and shaky. The moment he spoke, the footsteps stopped. Dead silence. I didn't answer him. I didn't dare make a sound. I held my breath, listening. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, I heard a new sound, and this one made my heart seize in my chest. It was a low, wet, sniffing sound coming from right behind my tent. It was so close I could hear the air being drawn in through massive nostrils. It was methodically sniffing the canvas, just inches from where Cal was lying. Cal's voice, a harsh whisper, came from inside. "Mark, do you hear that?" I couldn't form words. I just nodded in the darkness, a useless gesture. The sniffing continued for another 30 seconds. Then it stopped.
The heavy footsteps resumed, moving away from the tents and back towards the tree line. My training kicked in, overriding the panic. I needed to see it. I needed to know what we were facing. I grabbed the high-lumen flashlight from my pack, its aluminum body cold in my trembling hand. "Cal, I'm going to get a look," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Cover me." I heard the click of his rifle's safety being switched off. I moved to the flap of my tent, my movements slow and deliberate, trying not to make a sound. My fingers fumbled with the zipper, the metallic rasp sounding like a gunshot in the dead quiet. I pulled it open just enough to peer out, raising the flashlight. I took a deep breath, thumbed the switch, and painted a brilliant white beam across the tree line where the footsteps had faded. For less than a second, I saw it. The beam caught 2 points of light, 2 glowing, amber-colored eyes. They weren't the green or white eyeshine of a deer or a cat. They were a smoldering, fiery orange, like the embers of a dying fire. And they were high. Too high. They had to be at least 7 feet off the ground. Below the eyes, I had a fleeting impression of a massive, broad-shouldered silhouette, a shape of impossible bulk that was neither man nor beast. The moment the light hit it, the shape recoiled, ducking back into the trees with a speed that was horrifying for something so large. And then it was gone. The woods were empty again. I dropped back into the tent, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Did you see it?" Cal asked, his voice tight. "I saw its eyes," I breathed, trying to control my shaking. "And a shape. It's huge, Cal. Taller than a man. It was watching us." Brian was whimpering in his tent now, a low, panicked sound. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the larger tent, all 3 of us armed and awake, listening to the silence. Nothing else happened, but we knew it was still out there, waiting. At the first hint of dawn, we made a decision. We were leaving. This wasn't a hunt anymore. It was a tactical retreat. We didn't care about the deer or the gear. We were getting in the truck and driving until we hit pavement. We moved with quiet efficiency, breaking down the camp with a frantic, desperate energy. We didn't talk. We just worked, our eyes constantly scanning the silent, watching trees. The sun was up now, but the daylight brought no comfort. The woods felt just as menacing, the shadows just as deep. We were throwing the last of the gear into the bed of the truck when it started. A loud thwack echoed through the clearing as something heavy slammed into the side of Cal's truck. We all flinched. There was a new, fist-sized dent in the passenger door. "What was that?" Brian shrieked. Before either of us could answer, another projectile, a rock the size of a grapefruit, arced out of the trees and smashed into the fire pit, sending a shower of sparks and ash into the air.
It was throwing things at us, testing us. And then it stepped out of the woods. It emerged from the shadows of a large pine tree at the edge of the clearing and stood there in the full morning light, as if it had been waiting for a grand entrance. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The part of my brain that had been trained to identify threats, to categorize and react, simply shut down. It was impossible. It stood on two legs, but they were wrong. They were bent backwards, like a dog's, with powerful corded haunches. It was covered in thick, matted fur, the color of charcoal and mud. It stood at least 7.5 feet tall, with a chest and shoulders of immense width, tapering down to a narrow waist. Its arms were too long for its body, hanging down past its knees, and they ended in huge, 5-fingered hands tipped with thick, yellowed claws. But the head, my God, the head. It was the head of a monstrous wolf or a German shepherd, with a long snout, pointed ears that twitched and swiveled independently, and a powerful jaw lined with yellow fangs. But the eyes were not an animal's eyes. They were set forward in the skull, not to the sides, and they burned with that same smoldering orange intelligence I had seen in the flashlight beam. They were looking right at us, not with the simple hunger of a predator, but with a palpable, calculating malice. It was a thinking, reasoning creature, a monster from a nightmare given flesh and blood. We were frozen for a heartbeat, paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of the thing. Brian was the one who broke the spell. He screamed, a high, thin sound of pure terror, and he did the one thing he should not have done. He ran. He bolted for the driver's side door of the truck, fumbling for the handle. The creature moved. It wasn't a run or a charge. It was an explosion of motion. It covered the 30 yards between the tree line and the truck in 3 massive, loping strides. Its speed was unnatural, impossible for something of its size. It intercepted Brian before he'd taken 5 steps. It didn't use its claws or its teeth, not at first. One of its long arms swung out and clotheslined him, catching him across the chest. The impact threw him backwards 10 feet, and he landed in a crumpled heap, the air driven from his lungs in a choked gasp. He was still alive, trying to scramble backwards, his face a mask of disbelief and agony. The creature stood over him, looking down, and then it let out a sound. It was a low, guttural growl that vibrated in my bones, a sound of pure satisfaction. Then it bent down. I turned away. Cal started screaming Brian's name. I grabbed Cal by the collar and dragged him behind the front of the truck. "Stay down!" I yelled, my voice cracking. The sounds that followed will haunt me until the day I die. They were wet, tearing sounds, punctuated by the sharp crack of bone. It was over in seconds. When I dared to look again, the creature was standing up, and Brian was just gone. There was just a dark, spreading stain on the forest floor. The thing turned its head and looked directly at us, its long snout dripping. There was no rage in its eyes, only a cold, predatory focus. It had just killed one of us with casual, brutal efficiency, and now it was our turn. My training took over completely then. The terror was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was walled off behind a barrier of drills and discipline. "Cal, magazine!" I shouted. We both crouched behind the engine block of the truck, the only solid cover we had. I had my shotgun, Cal his .30-06 hunting rifle. The creature began to circle, using the trees at the edge of the clearing for cover. It was smart. It wasn't making a blind charge. It was using tactics. It was hunting us like we would hunt a deer, using cover and concealment, trying to get a better angle. It began throwing more rocks, not just to intimidate us, but with tactical purpose. One smashed the truck's windshield, showering the cab in shattered glass. Another hit our main lantern, which we'd left on a stump, and the clearing was suddenly much darker, lit only by the weak morning sun filtering through the trees and the dying embers of our fire. It was trying to blind us, to control the engagement. It was using tools. My mind reeled. This wasn't some cryptid or a misidentified bear. This was an intelligent, hostile adversary. "We have to move," I told Cal. "It's trying to pin us down." We were exposed. The truck offered some cover, but it could easily flank us. It let out another sound, a terrifying, high-pitched howl that ended in something that sounded horribly like a human scream. It was a psychological attack, meant to break our nerve. It was working. Cal was shaking, his face pale. "We're not going to make it, Mark," he whispered. "Shut up," I snapped, harsher than I intended. "We fight or we die. Those are the only options." The creature made its move. It darted from behind one tree to another, moving with that same fluid, unnatural speed. It was trying to get to the rear of the truck, where it would have a clear shot at us. I fired the shotgun, aiming for its center of mass. The buckshot tore through the leaves where it had been a second before. It was too fast. Cal fired his rifle, the boom echoing through the silent woods. The bullet smacked into the tree the creature was hiding behind, sending bark flying. It let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound of annoyance. It was a stalemate. We were pinned, and it was waiting for an opening. We were running low on ammunition. I had 3 shells left for the shotgun. Cal had maybe 4 rounds in his rifle. We couldn't stay there. I knew what we had to do. It was a desperate, stupid plan, but it was the only one I had. "On 3, we run for the cab," I told Cal. "Don't stop. Don't look back. Just get in the driver's seat and start the engine." He just stared at me, his eyes wide. "It'll get us before we make it 10 feet. "It'll get us if we stay here," I countered. "Now get ready." But before I could count, the creature changed its tactics again. It lunged from behind its cover, not at us, but at the front of the truck. It grabbed the massive steel grill guard with its clawed hands and pulled. Metal screamed and groaned in protest. With a surge of impossible strength, it began to lift the front end of the 3-ton vehicle off the ground. The tires spun uselessly in the air. It was trying to flip the truck, to remove our only piece of cover and our only means of escape. In that moment, as it was focused on the truck, its chest and shoulder were exposed. Cal, seeing the same opening I did, reacted without a word. He dropped his rifle and pulled the .44 Magnum revolver he always carried as a sidearm. It was a massive hand cannon of a gun, and he was a crack shot with it. He stood up, planting his feet, and leveled the pistol with a 2-handed grip. The creature, hearing the movement, turned its head towards him, its lips peeling back from its fangs in a snarl. The .44 boomed, a deafening concussion that was louder than any of the rifle shots. The heavy slug hit the creature high in the left shoulder. The impact was visible. The creature staggered back a step, a chunk of flesh and dark fur exploding from the entry point. It let out a roar, a sound of pure agony and incandescent rage that was unlike anything I had ever heard.
It wasn't the sound of an animal in pain. It was the shriek of a sentient being that had been grievously wounded, and it was filled with murderous fury. It dropped the truck, which slammed back down onto its suspension with a jarring crash. It clutched its shoulder, thick, blackish blood welling between its claws, and fixed Cal with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. Then it did something that chilled me more than anything else. It turned, and without another sound, it limped back into the forest and disappeared. It didn't fall. It didn't die. It was wounded, badly, but it had made a tactical decision to retreat. It broke off the attack. That was our chance. "Now, Cal, go!" I screamed. We didn't hesitate. We scrambled over the hood of the truck and yanked open the doors. I dove into the passenger seat as Cal slid behind the wheel. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely get the key into the ignition. I could hear him muttering Brian's name over and over again. The engine turned over, coughed, and roared to life. Cal slammed the truck into reverse, spinning the wheel. We shot backwards, tires squealing, and swung the truck around to face the logging trail. As we straightened out, the creature burst from the trees again, charging us head-on. Its shoulder was a mess, but it didn't seem to slow it down. Its face was a mask of fury, its fangs bared. It was going to stop us or die trying. Cal stomped on the accelerator. The truck leaped forward. There was a sickening, metallic crunch as we hit it. Or rather, as it hit us. It had thrown itself at the side of the truck as we passed, slamming its body into my door. The whole truck shuddered from the impact. The passenger window exploded inwards, spraying me with glass. I screamed as I saw its horrifying face right there, inches from mine, its orange eyes burning with hate. Its claws raked down the side of the truck, tearing through the sheet metal like it was tinfoil, the sound a horrific screech of tortured steel. Then we were past it. We were clear. Cal didn't slow down. He drove like a madman, flooring it down the rutted, winding trail. Branches scraped against the sides of the truck, and the suspension bottomed out repeatedly, but we didn't care. I looked back through the shattered rear window, half expecting to see it chasing us, but there was nothing. Just the empty, silent woods. We drove for what felt like hours, not saying a word, the only sounds our ragged breathing and the roar of the engine. We didn't stop until we hit the blessed, solid blacktop of the county highway. Only then did Cal pull over to the shoulder, cut the engine, and finally, completely, break down. We ended up in a small town called Ironwood. We walked into the county sheriff's office looking like we'd survived a plane crash. We were covered in dirt and my face was bleeding from the shattered glass. Cal was in a state of shock, barely able to speak. I did the talking. I told the sheriff on duty everything, from the silence in the woods to the final, horrifying attack. I left nothing out. He listened patiently, a weary, seen-it-all look on his face, taking notes on a legal pad. When I was done, there was a long silence. He looked from me to Cal, then down at his notes. He sighed. "Son," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "you've been through a major trauma. It's not uncommon for the mind to play tricks on you in a situation like that." He and a deputy went out to the site. They found what was left of Brian. They found our abandoned gear. The official report cited a bear mauling. A particularly aggressive black bear, they said. They pointed to the massive claw marks on the truck as proof. "See? Classic bear," the sheriff said, tracing one of the deep gouges with his finger. "They'll tear a car apart looking for food." I tried to argue. I told him a bear didn't throw rocks. A bear didn't stand 7 feet tall on 2 legs. A bear couldn't have lifted the front of an F-250. He just shook his head,
giving me a pitying look.
We were victims of a tragic accident, our minds clouded by grief and fear. That was the official story. Case closed. They called us heroes for managing to fight it off and escape. They never found the bear. As we were leaving the station, a day later, one of the older deputies, a man with a deeply lined face and tired eyes, caught me by the arm. He pulled me aside, out of earshot of the others. "Listen," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I've been working these woods for 30 years. You're not the first to come out of that forest with a story like this. Every few years, someone goes missing, or a camp gets torn to shreds. The official report is always a bear, or a mountain lion, or they just never find them." He looked me dead in the eye. "Take my advice. Go home, forget what you saw, and never, ever come back here. There are things in these woods that God left unfinished, and they don't like being disturbed." He was the only person who believed us.
Or at least, the only one who admitted it. That quiet, terrifying validation was worse than all the disbelief. It meant we weren't crazy. It meant the thing that killed Brian was real, and the people in charge knew it, or at least suspected it, and they were content to let it keep happening. It's been 5 years since that day. I don't hunt anymore. I can't. The thought of being in the woods, of hearing that profound, unnatural silence, brings on a panic that I can't control. I sold all my rifles, except for the shotgun I had that day. It stays in a safe in my closet. I moved out of my house in the country, and now I live in a condo in Lansing, surrounded by concrete and the noise of traffic. The sounds help me sleep. Sometimes. Cal and I don't talk much anymore. He moved to Phoenix a year after the incident. He couldn't stand the Michigan woods, couldn't stand the memories. We tried to talk about it once, on the phone, but the silence was too heavy. What could we say?
The shared knowledge of what we saw, of what we survived, is a chasm between us and the rest of the world. And the guilt. The guilt over Brian is a weight I carry every single day. He died because we took him there. He ran, and he died. Maybe if we'd stayed, if we'd been smarter, faster. I play it over and over in my head, but the ending is always the same. I spend a lot of nights online now, when the nightmares wake me up. I search forums and obscure websites, reading stories just like mine. Tales from all over the country, all over the world. People who saw something impossible in the deep woods, who were dismissed as crazy or liars. We're a quiet, traumatized community, bound by a truth that we can't share with anyone else. I'm telling this story now because I'm tired of being silent. I'm telling it for Brian, and I'm telling it as a warning. The world is not the safe, well-lit place you think it is. The maps have empty spaces, and in those spaces, things live. Ancient things.
Things that hate us. So if you're ever out in the woods, deep in the wild places, and the birds and the insects suddenly go silent, don't try to explain it away. Pack your gear and leave. Trust that primal fear that's screaming at you from the oldest part of your brain. It's trying to keep you alive. Don't wait to see the eyes. Don't wait for the sound of footsteps. Just run. Because some things, once seen, can never be unseen. And some truths are a heavier burden than any man should have to carry.